Hello and welcome to the Sectigo Identity First Security Summit. This is 5 positive security trends for 2022. I'm Tim Callan, Chief Compliance Officer at Sectigo, and I'm sitting here with Jason Soroko, CTO of PKI at Sectigo. How you doing today, Jason?
Doing great, Tim. Thanks for having me.
So for the listeners, there was an earlier session in this summit called 15 Security Fallacies We Still Suffer From in 2022 or something equivalent to that. That is kind of the companion piece to this one. So by all means, sit here and work with us today. But if you didn't see that other session, I would recommend going and trying to find it. It's also available as a webinar from Sectigo because we're building on some of the concepts that you saw there. But with that, let's get into it. 5 positive security trends for 2022. And just as a reminder to our listeners today, or our audience who's joining us today, you can talk to us using the Speak With Us button in your interface. Click on that and chat your questions or your comments. And Jason and I have an associate who's monitoring that in real time. And we'll make sure that we answer your questions or get back to you right away as we go through this conversation. So in the last session, we did go over the security fallacies that we suffer from still to this day. And what we wanted to do in this session is, rather than just sitting and moaning about maybe what's less than perfect, we wanted to offer some real practical advice and some ideas that people are using to make things better. Is that right, Jay?
That's right, Tim. In other words, because of the fact that we spent a lot of time talking about the bad side of things, bad trends, we had to point out the fact that there are some legitimate silver linings to a lot of this, and they come directly out of how people are now addressing those fallacies. These are really the positive trends.
Great, I love it. And let's break this down a little. We're going to get into all 5 of these. This first one is kind of a macro trend, if you will, which is that lessons from non-traditional architecture are making their way into legacy systems. And then these other 5 you see sort of fall out of that, right? Are at least partially owe themselves to that mega trend. Would you agree with that assessment, Jay?
I would agree, Tim. I think the first one needs to address the big elephant in the room, which is desktop operating systems are not leading security. It's everything else. And then everything else falls from that.
Right. So let's go ahead and get into that. So we see, right, these other kinds of environments like mobile, like IoT, like cloud native, like DevOps are driving security decisions and needs. And then the rest of your traditional legacy on-premise network or your desktop operating system start to say, aha, well, I can learn from that and I can get better. And that's definitely a big security trend that we've seen, right, Jay?
Tim, it's huge. So if you take a look at some of the biggest advancements in Windows and even in Mac operating systems, the big desktop operating systems that people use in the enterprise, I would say that they're now borrowing from mobile operating systems more than ever. And that has to do with how applications are isolated, how the various forms of memory are isolated, and also the use of secure enclaves. On Windows machines, it used to be optional to use a TPM. Now with Windows 11, you no longer have a choice. And those are things that were true in mobile systems going way back. The usage of secure enclaves, secure elements in IoT devices goes right back to their very beginning. And Tim, I think that one of the biggest trends that we've mentioned a few times now in this webinar, various webinars we've done in this virtual summit, has to do with application level authentication as a principle rather than network level authentication that you almost get by default with cloud native applications. So think about it. Most of your life that you've spent in a desktop operating system where you've got the warm and fuzzy from your AV antivirus, you've got it from your monitoring systems, and you're told all these rules you have to remember. Keep in mind, the real security trends that are positive have nothing to do with your desktop operating system. They have to do with your desktop operating system emulating the better aspects of mobile systems, cloud native systems, and IoT.
And do you think to some degree, is that because these other things just are newer? We had desktop PCs before we had mobile devices, and therefore by the time we got around to making mobile devices, we knew more about how to make them secure. Is it that simple?
Unfortunately, I think it is, Tim. So
Yeah.
therefore, if you think about it, Windows
Hmm.
was made before the internet,
Sure.
and it was made for why was it so successful? It was successful because it was the most interoperable operating system there was. You could plug in a printer, you could quickly install software, you could quickly
Yep.
get productive quickly.
Buy an aftermarket app. You could, yes.
It just worked.
Yeah.
It just worked. And that openness, that interoperability of that desktop operating system, which was the fundamentals of its success, the reason why it's ubiquitous, was no friend to security. That ubiquitousness and that openness and interoperability were the very things the bad guys were able to take advantage of.
Yep.
And so it took a long time because of the needs of backwards compatibility for Windows to catch up with, oh, we need to maintain interoperability, but also create isolation and security, because these things were not necessarily compatible. However, newer systems, as you say, they had that from the start.
And there's a certain amount of time that you need to make this kind of change. Like, so I think I think the best example of this is TPMs, right? Windows 10, the hardware, the requirement was that the hardware had to come with a TPM chip, but it didn't mean that the TPM chip had to be used, right? So what they did was they phased in. The phase in was in the course of Windows 10. Microsoft declared you cannot bundle Windows 10 if you don't have a TPM chip on your laptop. And then there was a certain amount of time leading up to even that being reality. And then they let that sit in the market for a certain amount of time. Now they can roll out Windows 11, and it's going to say Windows 11 always uses the TPM. And so this is the process, and it takes years to run through that kind of process, especially if you've got the vast ecosystem and the ludicrous just unit volume that you're looking at when you're looking at something like a basic OS like Windows.
Tim, exactly. I'm thinking down to, old days I used to have of having very, very overclocked gaming systems. Those could run Windows 10. They're not able to run Windows 11, and that's got a lot of people upset. But I think that it's going to pay major security dividends going forward.
Sure. Agreed. All right. So anyway, that's the overarching trend, and that's going to directly inform the other four trends that we're talking about here. The first of which is the movement to passwordless. So passwords, we like to dump on passwords a lot in our various media that we use, webinars and podcasts and whatnot, and probably for good reason. I know you're a big fan of passwordless and going there.
Yeah, Tim. So let's be really, really accurate here, since we've got a whole slide to really talk about this. Mm-hmm. It's not just a problem with username passwords. It's a problem with any form of shared secret as a form of authentication.
Right.
And we're not talking about legacy systems, right? We're talking about net new. If you're implementing a system going forward, brand new application, brand new network, whatever it happens to be, why in the world would you be using any form of shared secret, whether that's username and password alone, a username and password along with multi-factor authentication, or even whether it's with a symmetric token in place of a password? Why would you be building net new systems that authenticate in those legacy ways? To me, it's become very clear. Any form of shared secret has problems. We could have entire webinars based on the technicalities of that. Keep in mind that between key logging, between man-in-the-middle attacks, between just simply guessing, those kinds of shared secrets are a bad idea. Therefore, asymmetric-based secrets, such as crypto key pairs and certificates, far stronger forms of authentication. But it's not just that. It's a form of, let's talk about usability. Mm-hmm. This idea that you have to remember a username, remember a password, open up your phone, enter in an OTP, and by the way, all of those things that you've typed into your laptop are within a laptop that's potentially compromised. Therefore, you've given away all your secrets to the bad guy. That's the problem with a shared secret. All of that comes with the most lousy user experience. I'm getting so exhausted with that, Tim. It's terrible. You and I used to talk about RSA hard tokens where we used to have to carry 10 tokens for 10 applications. I'm starting to get to the point now where I've got at least 3 applications on my iPhone right now that are all called Authenticator, and they all do the same thing, but for different Tim, I'm fed up. Yeah. Please, no more applications with MFA. Thank you. And let's talk about MFA weaknesses here for a moment. If you guys haven't caught up yet, first of all, SMS as an authentication second factor, please. Even NIST deprecated it. I understand those of you who make the big Twitter arguments that say there is some value to it. I'm not even denying that. There is some value to it. Is that value high enough? That's the question I'm asking here. And to me, these forms of soft tokens, right, the OTP applications are getting to be a pain. Not only is the usability bad, but having to enter in an OTP into a compromised laptop is one thing. But you should also be taking a look at the security conferences and white hat research that's being done on basically breaking down MFA. In other words, MFA bypasses are becoming more and more common. So, Tim, it's finally time to go to Asymmetric Secrets. You can call it passwordless if you like. It's a marketing term. What we are talking about here is the move to asymmetric secrets, crypto key pairs, and preferably managed secrets such as a certificate.
Yeah, absolutely. Because a crypto key pair on its own has its own problems. And you and I have talked about that quite a bit too, right? Certificates really are the best practice. Yeah, so this is a big one, right? And we see this a lot. A lot of people are interested in this. We've also clarified in our podcast that there's what people call passwordless and there's actual passwordless. And there are things that people say is passwordless where there's still a password, it's just hidden. That has some of these benefits. Like it definitely has the usability benefits, but it doesn't have all of these benefits. And some of the benefits only come if you really move to key pair based identity verification or identity authentication. So, all right, with that, the next one, movement to application authentication. This is also a big topic for us. We talk about this a lot. But there's this old school kind of 15 years ago, 20 years ago idea to say there's a perimeter, and as long as I can secure the perimeter, then everything inside is kind of a green zone and I can move around safely and there's no need to worry. And I think that idea has been very thoroughly disproven at this stage in history, right, Jay?
Tim, in that time frame that you're talking about, you were probably authenticating to Active Directory in most enterprises. Mm-hmm. That's probably true even to this day. And so therefore, still to this day, most people, for a lot of things, are authenticating into their network and being given access from there. There's major problems with that. Most networks are too flat. And not only that, but basically your ability to isolate on your network is bounded by your ability to make the argument that your various departments in your enterprise cannot interoperate. You're going to get a terrible pushback from that. So therefore, all of these problems go away. All of them go away if you start authenticating at the application level and not at the network level. Now that's meaning probably changing the way you use Active Directory, maybe getting away from Active Directory completely. But it enables you to use much stronger forms of authentication at the application level, meaning you're isolating at the most discrete level of logic possible. From a security standpoint, this is a major, major positive movement in the world today. I've probably repeated this 3 or 4 times in every webinar we've given in this virtual summit. I will continue to repeat it, Tim, as long as you and I do podcasts and webinars.
Yep, and this directly relates to zero trust, which is another big trend right now and something that I think we both believe in very strongly. Next trend is the movement to isolation more generally. So application level authentication is an example of isolation, but it's not the only example, right, Jay?
Yeah, a lot of what we've already talked about in this webinar has to do with isolation. The application
Hmm.
level authentication is an example of isolation. But I wanted to address something very specific, which is this this problem of monitoring, right? In other words, can you monitor your way to security? I think in another webinar that we gave, I gave the example
Hmm.
of the OPM breach where a multi-billion-dollar monitoring system was completely hosed. Well, if multi-billion-dollar system gets hosed, what chances do the rest of us have?
Yeah.
I think that network level isolation, which again is another zero trust principle, I think that every time you make a logical isolation in your network that makes a lot of sense, you are being paid huge dividends in security. In other words, if it's not hurting you to make that isolation on your network, it's basically completely stopping the bad guy. And that's a good thing. But it even goes beyond that, Tim, because when I like to include the big trends towards memory safe languages. And for those of you who are
Hmm.
not as technical, uh, just listen for a second. There are now languages. You might have heard of C, C++, very common lower level languages. The problem with them is quite often that software that's built with those languages have memory issues, which leads to the problem of fuzzing, right? Buffer overflows. We've heard of all these things that lead to 0 days. Geez, that's a lot of buzz terms I've just thrown out. The reason why those buzz terms are common is because they're very common problems due to the complexities of memory handling of those lower level languages. Well, what's now been decided is, why are we giving programmers who simply do not have the ability to
Yeah.
to code with those memory errors in mind? Why don't we make the language memory safe? In other words, no
Right.
more C++ pointers, no more problems that are just difficult to manage or to detect. Why not have languages that no longer are susceptible to buffer overflows? Languages such as Rust, if you want to go do a search on that, those are really good examples of huge bright lights that are going to get us away from the days of buffer overflows. Not entirely. We're always going to have legacy, but at least we're moving in the right direction.
And then last, we have movement to good certificate lifecycle management tools. So we've talked about some about digital identity, and digital identity practically in the real world means that that is driven by certificates. And so having those tools, having good tools in place is essential is essential to best practices and a very important trend we're seeing, right, Jason?
It's an incredibly important trend because if we're going to be asking people to move towards asymmetric secrets rather than shared
Hmm.
secrets, right? We
Right.
talk about that, what that means. Then we need to be able to provide the tools for people to do that properly.
Yeah.
And if I were to really break this down, we've covered a lot of this in previous webinars already in this virtual summit. But what it comes down to is, are you getting the secrets in a secure manner? Are you putting them to where they need to be in a secure manner? And are you using them in a secure manner? And do you have visibility to them? And so therefore, from the common pitfalls webinar to the fallacies webinar, if you wrap up everything we said about asymmetric secrets, meaning crypto
Hmm.
keys and meaning certificates, then what I'd like to argue is that in 2022 and beyond, the the bright light is those tools that you needed to use stronger forms of authentication are now there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
part of that, Tim, has to do with you have the right place to put the credentials. In other
Hmm.
words, you've got the TPM, you've got the enclaves, you got the secure elements, but also you have the protocols to be able to get the certificate from the CA, put it where it needs to be, and then the ability to use those things for authentication and network level authentication. You have those things. Remember, all these types of secrets have basically a birth certificate, death certificates, right? In other words, they there's policies you have to write around them. In other words, they have to renew. It's
Right.
not just issuance. It's not just the using. There's also the life cycle. And that's why we call this good certificate life cycle management. The entire life cycle of these incredibly important forms of credential form factors are now able to be securely in place. And that's maybe the brightest light we have in 2022 and beyond.
I love it very much. I think that's a great one. So if you like this conversation, Jason and I do have a popular podcast series called Root Causes, a PKI and security podcast. And we talk about all kinds of matters like we discussed today. We talk about digital identity, PKI, cryptography, industry standards, things along those lines. Just search for us in the, iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, other places that you listen to podcasts. Subscribe. We'd love to have you join us. You can always message us on LinkedIn and tell us what you think and ask your questions. And we get a lot of that. So with that, thank you very much. This has been 5 Positive Security Trends for 2022. This is the Sectigo Identity First Security Summit. I am Tim Callan. I'm sitting here with Jason Soroko. This was 5 Positive Security Trends for 2022. Thank you very much.